In the lush expanse of New Zealand, you could scream at the top of your lungs and no one could hear you. Why? Because there are only 20 people for every square kilometer. That's right, 80% of this breathtaking land is almost empty. So what's the story behind the vast, isolated expanses? Join us as we dive into the secrets of New Zealand's wilderness. But before we get started, subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon to never miss a video from us. So, New Zealand has about 5.2 million. That sounds like a lot, but when you look at the whole wide world, it's only a tiny 0.06%. And when it comes to ranking countries by population, New Zealand ranks at 123rd. Can you even think of being in the middle of land with only 20 people per each square kilometer around? With a world average of 52 people, you can see why New Zealand feels like this big, open playground. Here's the deal. New Zealand was one of the last places on Earth to be settled by humans. Think about that for a second. Around 1300 AD, the ancestors of the Maori people came sailing across the sea, finding this untouched land. Europeans didn't even make real contact until British explorer James Cook popped by in 1769. But why so late? Well, New Zealand's quite a trek from anywhere else. It wasn't like hopping on a plane. The early settlers, mostly from Britain and Ireland, had to endure long and expensive journeys. They were lured by dreams of gold and the promise of cheap land. And they made sure not everyone came close. Now, have you ever thought about what it means to move to a new country? With the immigration process today, it might take some time, but sounds possible. However, in the past, some people didn't even have the chance. Let's go back to a time when New Zealand's doors weren't open to all. In the late 1800s, the government was rolling out policies that favored British and European immigrants over others. If you were Chinese back then, you'd even have to pay a poll tax to enter. And this didn't change overnight. The so-called White New Zealand policy kept going, with language tests and quotas keeping non-white immigrants at bay. These policies painted a picture of New Zealand that was, honestly, pretty exclusionary. But after the Second World War, things started to shift. New Zealand needed workers, and suddenly the door creaked open a bit wider. Agreements with Pacific countries allowed seasonal workers in, and New Zealand's population began to diversify. Fast forward to 1975 and 1987, and everything changed again. Now, immigrants were selected according to their skills and qualifications, not where they're from. The land that once was so selective began to welcome people from all walks of life. But even now, 80% of New Zealand is uninhabited. 3/4 of New Zealand's people are living on the North Island, many in bustling Auckland with over 1.5 million people, while the South Island remains a paradise of open spaces. You might wonder why people cluster together in certain spots. Well, cities offer jobs, entertainment, and convenience. But in New Zealand, this leaves vast areas of the country practically untouched. And New Zealand's rugged beauty also plays a role. Can you imagine if you want to visit your neighbor, but they live about 2,000 kilometers away? That's how far New Zealand is from Australia. And if you want to reach the Pacific Island nations like Fiji or Tonga, you'll still have to travel around 1,000 kilometers. Being so far from everything means that getting stuff in or out is a bit more costly and tricky. It's not as easy as just hopping over a fence. Now let's talk about mountains. If you like mountains, you'll love New Zealand. There's a huge mountain range that runs through both the North and South Islands. It's like a spine, giving the country its unique shape and character. Among these towering peaks, you'll find Aoraki/Mount Cook, the tallest of them all, standing like a sentinel over the landscape. But here's the thing, those mountains aren't just there to look pretty. They're a bit like gigantic walls, dividing the South Island into two very different places. On one side, you have the West Coast, where it's so wet and green, you'd think that the rain was trying to set a record. Places like Milford Sound get a mind-boggling 6.412 millimeters of rain a year. You'd practically need a boat to get around. On the other side, you've got areas like Canterbury Plains, where it's so dry you might forget what rain looks like. Take Alexandra in central Otago. They only get about 358 millimeters of rain a year. It's a strange balance, making it harder to live. And these mountains, they're not just a barrier for the weather, they are a real obstacle course if you're trying to build roads or railways. Trying to lay down tracks or pave a road over those steep, rugged slopes is a mammoth task, and it sure doesn't come cheap. Then there are volcanoes and earthquakes. Now, if mountains were the walls, Then volcanoes are the fireworks of New Zealand. The North Island is practically dancing on hot coals with several active volcanoes like Mount Ruapehu, Mount Tongariro, and White Island. These fiery mountains can get a bit moody and cause a lot of problems for the nearby towns and cities. Then there's the shaking ground underfoot. The South Island, especially along the Alpine Fault, is no stranger to earthquakes. Who could forget the devastating quake in Napier in 1931 that wiped out most of the city? Or the more recent ones in Christchurch that shook the ground and people's lives to the core. These natural disasters aren't just physical blows, they leave emotional scars that can run deep. But wait, there's more. Climate change has entered the scene, and it's throwing everything out of balance. Rising sea levels, increasing temperatures, weird precipitation patterns, and storms that just doesn't know when to quit. It's all happening in New Zealand. Take the Southern Alps, for example. Less snow and shrinking glaciers may not seem like a big deal, but think of hydroelectric power and irrigation systems relying on that frozen water, or farmers who look to the sky and pray for rain, only to find drought one season and flooding the next. And don't get us started on wildfires, pests, and invasive species. It's a real mess. And even those living in New Zealand don't stick around. Now, it may sound strange, but there are actually more people leaving than arriving in New Zealand. In this year, till March 2023, New Zealand said goodbye to about 7,300 more people than it welcomed. First up, there's the whole work thing. Imagine being young and ambitious, but feeling like the opportunities and great pay are elsewhere. Some Kiwis are moving to places like Australia, looking for a bigger job market. Did you know that the median house price in New Zealand in June 2023 was $920,000? That's up 23.4% from a year ago. No wonder people have trouble finding a place to call home. And let's not forget about the students. College is not cheap. With tuition costs rising and student loans piling up, some young people are packing their bags and looking for education or work elsewhere. But wait, New Zealand is rolling up its sleeves and trying to fix things. For example, they have this new thing called Accredited Employer Work Visa, also known as the AEWV scheme. It's all about making it easier for employers to hire skilled migrants. Sounds like a step in the right direction, right? So what's in the future for New Zealand? The government has its work cut out, literally, to cover so much ground. Will they be able to tame the wild while preserving its magic? What do you think is next in the New Zealand chapter? Let us know in the comments. Enjoyed this video? Don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. See you next time!